Well, last words are quite unforgettable. Todd Beamer tried to regain control of the hijacked Flight 93 on 9/11, and his words were caught on a phone. Let's roll. Those words, those last words of Todd Beamer. Steve Jobs created Microsoft. His final words, he said 3 times to his family on his deathbed, were, "Oh, wow." Kurt Cobain, some have heard of him, a very famous musician. In his final words written on his suicide note were, "It's better to burn out than to fade away." Jane Austen, famous authoress, said to her sister Cassandra on her deathbed, "I want nothing but death." Elvis Presley, in public, his last words were, "I hope I haven't bored you." Privately, he said, "I'm going to the bathroom to read." And that's where he found him when he passed. Frank Sinatra, famous singer, said, "I'm losing it." Diana, Princess of Wales, isn't it hard to believe 25 years this month that Diana passed? Her final words overheard in the car accident was, "My God, what happened?" Also from the UK, and I think this is my favorite, a comedian and a writer named Spike Milligan, his final words, "I told you I was ill." When I read that, I was reminded of the story of the pastor who went to visit a fellow who was unwell in the hospital, but he was getting better. And he's standing beside the fellow, and he's got oxygen line in, and all of a sudden the fella starts to have an attack. And he grabs a piece of paper and a pen, and he scribbles something and hands it to the pastor, who then puts it in his coat jacket. But then the alarms go off, and it's a code blue, and this fella's needing help, and so the pastor's ushered out of the room, and the fella dies. A few days later, the pastor's standing at the front at the funeral, and he's speaking, and he's thinking about this brother who died, and he says, "And I just remembered that he spoke some last words in writing. He handed me a piece of paper before he passed, and I think I was wearing the same jacket. I am." And he pulls it out, and he says, "You're standing on my oxygen line." Now, why did you laugh at that? I think I should be a little concerned that you laughed about that. Last words. Well, I don't have a photo, but the Apostle Paul's last words to a particular group of people are recorded in the passage that we just read together. I've entitled this message, "Last Words to Leaders." This is Paul's final conversation to the Ephesian church's leaders. And these words that he's about to speak are very pastoral, but even more so, think of a dad. Think of a dad speaking to his children for the very last time. And he has 2 overarching messages for them. Consider my example and consider my instructions. Consider my example, consider my instructions. Paul is not the object of our worship if we know Jesus and follow Jesus. He's not the object of our walk with God, but Paul is a model of our walk with God. And so he says, look at my example, and he's worth listening to here. Now, to be precise, the emphasis of this passage is less about last words and more about church leadership principles. You say, is there such a thing? Is there a local church biblical leadership understanding in the New Testament? There actually is. But what we seem to have done in the big C church, through all our little c churches, is we've added this huge layer of religion and human philosophy and thinking on top of biblical revelation, to the point where we just kind of accept whatever flavor of leadership a particular church might have. And believers just kind of follow along. But beloved, disciples of Jesus, what better source or resource do we have than God's word for our understanding about this? God's word is God's will for us. This is God's word, and this is life. We always need to be asking the question about everything, but certainly about church-related governance and structure. Is this biblical? Does this model square with the revealed Word of God? Here at Belmont Village Church, we want to be that kind of church. One that keeps asking the question, what does God's revealed Word and will say about this or that or the next thing? So, we get to listen in to Paul instructing these Ephesian church leaders, and by doing so, we get to learn how to become a better disciple of Jesus. Because here's the deal. Here's the deal. What every elder leader in a church must be, every follower of Jesus should be. Should I say that again? Yes? No? Okay. What every elder leader in the church must be, every believer in the local church should be. The list of qualities for a church leader in 1 Timothy 3 and in Titus 1, do you know what they have in front of that list? They have a must be. I really wish they didn't. I looked it up in Greek. I thought, I hope it's not actually must be. But in both texts, must be. That doesn't mean perfectly, but a leader must be. So, but the point is, every believer should be. Every believer should be. So, right here in our passage, there are 3 expressive words used of church leaders, and here they are on the screen. Number 1, in verse 18, you saw the word elders. That word is presbyteros. And it literally means this: maturity, not necessarily in age, but in experience and in judgment. It's a spiritual maturity. And then down in verse 28, which we didn't read this week, we will next week, is the word overseers, episkopos. And it literally means one who sees over, supervisor, superintendent, a ruler. Also in verse 28, the word shepherds, poimaino, and it literally means to tend, to herd, to pastor, to shepherd. In Ephesians 4 and 11, where we have that list of God has given apostles, prophets, evangelists, shepherds, or pastors and teachers, it's the word poimaino. Now, all of these same words, these 3 same words, appear again in another list in 1 Peter 5, 1-2. We won't turn to it, but all 3 words again. Elder, presbyteros. Overseer, episkopos. Shepherd, poimaino. Here's the point. All elders in a local church are also overseers. All elders, overseers in a local church are also pastors. You say, wait a minute, I'm confused. Aren't you the pastor of Belmont Village Church? I am just a pastor among other pastors. I am a leader among equals. That's what God's word says. All elders are overseers, are shepherds. Now, I did some digging. Where do these terms come from? Like, where did they originate? And I had never, ever discovered this before, but apparently elders comes from the Jewish community, Jewish thinking. Overseers comes from the Greek community. And shepherds comes from the rural agrarian community. So it's like all bases are covered. So we're going to look at all 3 of these expressions over the next couple of weeks. And we're also going to look at what is said about local church leaders, and we'll learn some important lessons. All right? But first, Luke's all about, and he's really good at, travel details. And so from verses 13 to 16, we have their travel log, which we read together. So I'm just going to read it here, especially for the recording, for those who will find this message afterwards. In verse 13, Luke is writing and he says, "We went on ahead to the ship and sailed for Assos, where we were going to take Paul aboard. He had made this arrangement because he was going there on foot. When he met us at Azos, we took him aboard and went on to Mytilene. Now you're probably wondering, okay, how far did he walk? Troas to Azos by boat is 80.5 kilometers. By foot, 33.8 kilometers. I'm thinking Paul needed to get his steps in for the day. All right? That's about a 9 to 10 hour walk with very little breaks. He likely wanted to spend some solo time with God. Paul was engaged with people nonstop. And this was a time he just said, I need 10 hours with God. And since you guys are going to be taking a long time to sail down to Azos, I'm going to walk. And the boat probably got there first, and they waited for him. And so that's the context here. And you know what? That's always a good thing to do as a disciple of Jesus, to go on a solo walk with God. And this summer weather makes solo time with God kind of inviting. But any time of year, in any weather, it's a good thing. So 15 to 16, the next day we set sail from there and arrived off Chios. The day after that, we crossed over to Samos, and on the following day arrived at Miletus. Paul had decided to sail past Ephesus to avoid spending time in the province of Asia, for he was in a hurry to reach Jerusalem, if possible, by the day of Pentecost. This is Paul's third missionary journey, so let's look at the map really quickly. He's been up in Macedonia. This is all in chapter 20. He's come down here to Troas. That's where Eutychus fell asleep, remember last time? And he had to basically raise him from the dead. And then they've gone on to Mytilene, Chios, Samos, and they are now in Miletus, and here's Ephesus. So why did they not go into the harbor here in Ephesus? And there's actually a couple of theories about why they sailed past Ephesus. The more obscure theory that many theologians like to talk about is that there was a silt buildup in the port of Ephesus, and so deep water vessels couldn't sail in there. Well, okay, that could be the case, but we're told in the text why. Right? I really do subscribe to, if the plain sense makes sense, then any other sense is nonsense. And so the plain sense is what the text tells us. He was in a hurry to get to Jerusalem by Pentecost. He wanted to be there for that festival. Paul knew if he stopped in Ephesus, it would be nonstop meetups with friends. Come to my place for lunch, Paul. Join us at the Mandarin for dinner, Paul. Come to our place for a bonfire this evening, Paul. It'd be nonstop. And he was extremely well known in Ephesus. When we get to verse 31, we're going to learn that he lived there for at least 3 years. So if he stopped in Ephesus, he would miss Pentecost in Jerusalem, and he doesn't want to. Okay, so Paul, Luke, and others are in Miletus, and what happens? Well, this is the story of the elders from Ephesus coming down. He asked these guys to come 80 kilometers. But they love Paul so much, they're willing. How far would you walk or ride on a donkey to see someone that you respected and honored and valued when they invited you? They were willing to come. Now remember, I said that Paul is giving them a father's example and then a father's instruction. Verses 17 to 24 contains just the example. There are 3 church leadership principles in Paul's example. Okay? Now, I don't think we're going to get through all 3 this morning, and if not, God willing, we'll get through them next Sunday and then transition to Paul's instructions. Okay? So first is example. And it's interesting that the principles here taught by Paul's example are in the form of commitments. If you look on the screen, here's the 3, in case we don't get to them this morning. A commitment to living an open life. That's verses 17 to 20. Paul is saying to these leaders, that's what you're committing to as a leader in the church. Now, this is what every believer should commit to, but every leader needs to. A commitment to an open life. Secondly, a commitment to declaring the gospel of Jesus with whatever gifting we have. That's in verse 21. And then thirdly, a commitment to denying self and carrying one's cross. That's verses 22 to 24. All right, let's look at just the first one, a commitment to living an open life, verse 17. From Miletus, Paul sent to Ephesus for the elders of the church. When they arrived, look what he said. He said to them, "You know how I lived the whole time I was with you. From the first day I came into the province of Asia, I served the Lord with great humility and with tears, and in the midst of severe testing by the plots of my Jewish opponents." You know, I read about 6 months ago, apostleship and hardship are two ships that always sail together. And it's true with Paul. His apostleship is about being sent on God's kingdom business, and in some way that mission will always be opposed. Hardship comes with apostleship. Verse 20, "You know that I have not hesitated to preach anything that would be helpful to you, but have taught you," notice it says publicly, there were public forums, "and from house to house." But look back at verse 18. "You know how I lived the whole time I was with you." A church leader has a commitment to living an open life. And again, what a church leader must be, every believer should be. Do I live an open life? You know, at times someone will ask me, "Gord, how are you doing?" Some of you do that. "How are you doing?" And I generally know that you mean it in every way. Like, how are you doing physically? How are you doing spiritually, your walk with God? How are you doing relationally with Karen, with family? How are you doing emotionally? How are you doing, the church, your neighborhood? You're asking all those things. But some people ask, and I can't know this, but they don't mean to ask in every way. But not knowing that, I might go ahead and share. Well, physically, I'm doing great. Emotionally, a little edgy for some reason lately. Relationally, I'm struggling with some relationship stuff in our family. And you know what? I keep forgetting where I put my phone and my keys. It's so annoying. And then all of a sudden I'll notice that the person I'm talking to is like a deer in the headlights. They were asking how I was doing, but all they wanted to hear was, "Fine." That's all they wanted. I definitely just overshared. Okay, has this happened to you with anyone? Okay, my rant is finished. But I said this, I said that to say this. When someone straight up asks you how you're doing in your relationship with God, if you're like me, isn't the default response to start with your scorecard of how many quiet times I had last week, of all the things that I'm doing for God, of how often I listen to Faith FM. Of course, I'm supporting the new Chick-fil-A Christian chicken restaurant. Of course I am. What, you have a different scorecard than that? Is there a different scorecard than that? There really is. But here's my point, and I think we learn this from Paul. Don't just go to you and your little world and stop there. Paul says it's about how am I doing in relation to the people I'm in relationship with. You know how I lived. How about the people I'm walking with in their journey, including their drama and their pain? You know how I lived. How about the people I'm intentionally sharing Jesus and the hope of the gospel with? You know how I lived. Paul says, you know how I lived. The whole time I was with you, from the first day I was with you. I don't know about you, but could you say that? Would you like to say that to people when they ask you how you're really doing? Well, you know how I lived. We would like to. And the hope of the gospel is we can start from this day forward being able to. But this is quite the example for Paul. For 3 years, you know how I lived. Wow. He's saying, I wasn't the preacher who came to preach and was just with you for 2 weeks and then left. Now, he was there for 3 years. In fact, he rented space in the school of Tyrannus for 2 years. Talk about a public setting for people to see the real Paul. Paul moved into the neighborhood. They had many breakfasts with Paul, lunches with Paul, and how many suppers together. They interacted with, met with, prayed with, served with, laughed and cried with. They observed his behavior, but more importantly, his character. They observed how tough and resilient and durable God made Paul to be, and how tender, respectful, and dependable God made Paul to be. They observed how he treated people. You know what this tells me too? An elder must be among people. Must be among people. Not an ivory tower leader. A leader among the people. They observed how he treated people. They saw how he interacted with people who were poor, who were marginalized and discounted in the city of Ephesus. They were likely weddings they were at together and funerals. There were babies born and there were maybe babies that died. Through the marvelous and the messy moments, they observed how big God was to Paul and how small Paul was to Paul. In fact, notice what he says in verse 19. He talks about his humility. He says something I don't think I will ever come out of my mouth, okay? Except quoting him. I served the Lord with great humility. Who says that? Paul said that with deep sincerity. I served the Lord with great humility. In fact, he states here 4 categories of what they know about him. Notice in verse 19, humility, sadness or sorrow, danger, that's in verse 19, and verse 20, his teaching. You know about all these things. They observed his vulnerability. We often won't share our weaknesses with people, and the reason we say is they may not be safe. But the reality is that it's less about them being safe and more about us being proud. Maybe I'm just speaking for me. They saw Paul's flaws. Over 3 years, Paul likely blew some tires. They saw him sin. Sins of omission and sins of commission. Things he said and did that were never intended to hurt people, but they hurt people. Things that he said or did that were maybe birthed in a weak moment, or a blocked goal, or a selfish impulse that also hurt people. But all of that didn't erase the habit of his life, which was godliness. I don't know how you react or respond when you read in 1 John, if we sin. Whenever I read that, I say, what do you mean, Paul? If we sin. If we sin. We all sin. Of course we sin. You can't be alive and not sin. No one is surprised that you sin. Did you know that? No one. And no one should be surprised that I sin. But what he's talking about, what John is talking about by the Holy Spirit, is the habit of one's life. If we sin habitually, this is true of us. We're outside of Jesus. If we don't sin habitually, this is proof that we're in Christ. The habit of Paul's life was about being a man of God, a man of integrity after God's heart. They no doubt saw Paul confess his sin to them, his friends. And as elders in the church, those very elders probably prayed for Paul's healing. They saw what Paul lived and that he taught what he lived what he taught. And that is this, that we have received in the gospel what we cannot earn and what we do not deserve. They intimately saw and knew Paul. You've heard me say this before. Intimacy. Into me you see. And Paul was okay with that. He wanted them to know him thoroughly. You know how I lived. But Paul didn't just care about how he lived to people in the church. He cared about what people outside the community of the church observed. That's why in 1 Timothy 3, an elder must have a good reputation with those in the community. They really know how we live our lives. In fact, they're watching like hawks. When our daughter Ruth Ann was in grade 9, we'd moved to a new city in Hamilton, and she was starting a brand new high school, and she readily made friends. And she made friends with a number of girls, and they all started coming to Friday night youth group. But there was one just really quality character girl named Jen. And she would come to Friday night youth group, and she would have conversations with Ruth Ann and other friends about faith. And one by one, all these friends started coming to Jesus, but not Jen. And honestly, it was confusing. We were praying so much for Jen, and it just seemed like she was just so ready and yet holding out. But do you know that after a year went by, she went to Ruth Ann one day, and she said, I'm ready to receive Jesus. She said, well, that's great. She said, I was ready the first day I met you, but I made a commitment right then that I would watch you for a year to see if you were real. I wanted to see if what you were about was real. And I'm convinced it is. And I want Jesus. And Jen gave her life to Christ. I didn't know you could kind of set a timetable like that with God. I think that's dangerous to do that, but God knew her heart, how sincere she was. She wanted to know that this was real. People are watching. People are observing. And Paul says, I'm good with that. You know how I lived. A commitment to living an open life is about living the gospel every day. Again, we tend to look at the scorecard of our own little world of thinking, right? So I might think, I'm a great neighbor. How about you? Do you think you're a great neighbor to have? I'm a great neighbor to have. I hope I never forget the story that I'm about to share that literally gave me a jolt when I read it. An author named Kent Aikenberry tells the story of when he and his wife Diana met a new couple at church one Sunday. And here's what he says, quote, we stopped to introduce ourselves and to exchange pleasantries. Do you do that? Do you exchange pleasantries? Some of you are like, I don't know what a pleasantry is. Well, someone will exchange one with you later. But we described our friendly church to them and the friendly neighborhood we lived in, and then listened sympathetically as they lamented that the neighborhood that they had moved into recently was just the opposite to ours. It was not friendly. No one had reached out to welcome them in their neighborhood. Well, Kent and Diana were sympathetic and said something innocuous like, well, hopefully things will improve. And they said goodbye. They got in their cars and they drove home. And Kent writes these words, and this is where I got the jolt. As we approached our house, we were horrified to see that our newfound friends were pulling into the driveway next to ours. I'd be putting a for sale sign in the front lawn at night, in the dark that night. Paul says, you know how I lived the whole time I was with you. It wasn't just about Paul's messages and the things they heard from his mouth. It was about watching Paul's life and seeing how he lived that message. Edgar A. Guest wrote these words, I'd rather see a sermon than hear one any day. I'd rather one should walk with me than merely tell the way. The eye is a better pupil, more willing than the ear. Fine counsel is confusing, but example is always clear. And the best of all preachers are those who live their creeds, for to see a good put in action is what everybody needs. Not that declaring the gospel of Jesus doesn't matter. It does. In fact, we're about to see a huge commitment to that through the example of Paul next time. But what's seen in our lives precedes what comes out of our lips. Does that make sense? What's seen in our lives precedes what comes out of our lips. Now, I want to close with this question. How is any of this possible, Paul? Like, how do you have the audacity to say, you know how I lived the whole 3 years I was with you? Well, Paul would say this, only through Jesus alive in me. Only through Jesus alive in me. Galatians 2:20. Listen, Paul through the Spirit penned these words. It is no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me. The life I now live in my body, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. I am so challenged by that. Too often, Gord lives in my body, and I live by faith in me. And that's where it ends. But so much in life is right when it's no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me. And when I live each moment by faith in Jesus, who loved me and gave himself for me. Do you understand what those last lines of that verse are saying? The Son of God who loved you and gave himself for you. Jesus was willing to die for a relationship with you and with me. And so the question is the good news that you believe and the faith in Jesus you have, is it worth dying for? I've been thinking about that all week, and I don't know if I'm willing to die for a relationship with him. If push came to shove, the way it will for Paul shortly. I have times when I struggle living for him, so how would I do dying for him? But I know this. God gives grace when we need it. And we need it to live open lives before others now. Our neighbors, our friends, our family members, they will listen to what we say if they want what we have. But they won't listen to what we say if they don't want what we have. And listen, I get it. That's up to God's Spirit to open people's hearts, to see their need and to want salvation through Jesus. That is true. But God's Spirit wants to use you, wants to use me as his visual aid in their lives. You know how I lived. People are longing to see a supernatural life. And they won't see it through you and I living our natural lives. They will only see it through Jesus living. He is the better man. He is the better person living in me. I'm not there yet, but I want to be. I want to be. How about you? Let's pray. Father, many of my brothers and sisters are sitting here at home or in person, and they can say, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. And Father, this morning we're going to reenact why we know that is true. We are here at the Lord's table, and we are remembering before you, Father, that Jesus loved us so much, he gave everything, including his life, for us. So as we come forward, those of us who know you as Savior and as Lord, as we come forward and we take a piece of bread, we recognize that this is symbolizing his body that he gave, that was broken for us because he loves us. And as we take this juice, we're going to recognize afresh that he poured out his life's blood because he loves us. And if there's anyone who could say, you know how I lived, it's Jesus. And so, Father, as we think about him and his death, and the fact that as we take this bread and this juice and it remembers itself in our bodies, within us, Lord, he has risen again. He has remembered his body, and he's alive. God, thank you for this incredible, incredible story that is true. And Father, I just pray for anyone who is gathering with us this morning who does not yet know Jesus. It is perfectly fine for you to sit in your seat and to just observe what's happening, to not come forward and take these symbols. This is for people who know Jesus. And so, Lord, we just thank you right now for what you did, for who you are in our lives. Thank you for these symbols of your love for us. May they affect us, Lord. May we go from this place differently than the way we came. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen.